Hello, I'm Emmanuel Cleaver. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion on economic justice, examining the financial burdens of inequality and striving for an equitable COVID-19 recovery. So I want to express appreciation to you for choosing to tune in and engage in this very, very important conversation. And while we have taped this exchange, I'm confident that the thoughtful panel we have been fortunate to assemble will provide insight that will also be timely and would also be almost contemporary to the moment you participate. The pandemic has created all kinds of problems for us right in the middle of what we've been calling a racial reckoning period. We are facing issues of life and death, and they are both consequences of inequality. African Americans and Latinos are 3 times more likely to be infected with COVID-19 and twice as likely to die from it. The CDC highlighted in late July that among the factors that have created these disparities are inequality in occupation, housing, education, income, and wealth. As we seek to wrap our heads around these huge, huge problems, I think we all should look at this moment and figure out ways in which we can do our part. It is my goal that this panel will offer real insight into the causes of the deep economic disparities that have beset marginalized communities during this pandemic. And so I also hope that this panel will assess how the Federal Reserve is responding to rescue these vulnerable populations. Finally, I know the participants will derive real answers to what an equitable recovery will look like for communities of color. And while I leave it to the moderator to guide this important conversation and introduce all of our brilliant and talented participants, it is my honor to introduce the person who will moderate this important discussion. I've called on him. It seems like anytime I'm trying to do something significant. A few years ago, I was able to get him to chair a group of African-American business leaders to a White House meeting with President Barack Obama. Here I am calling on him again, and I'm putting it on my calendar to call on him again next year and some other new things. But Robert Johnson is founder and chairman of RLJ Companies, a business network that owns or holds interest in businesses operating in hotels around the world, private equity, 401k, fintech, and much, much more. Prior to forming RLJ Companies, Mr. Johnson was co-founder of B.E.T, America's first Black-owned television network, and emerged as America's first Black billionaire. Bob, I turn the conversation over to you, and thank you very much for your willingness again to moderate this program.
Thank you, Congressman Cleaver. I'm delighted to be here with you and the other members of Congress and the members from the Federal Reserve. I think everybody's had a sort of an introduction from our technical people regarding how this will operate. I'm going to try to move it along as quickly as possible to give you and the members of the Federal Reserve as much time to have a dialogue. I think the good part about this conversation is that there is a fundamental commonality of interest on both the members of Congress and the members of the Federal Reserve to focus on socioeconomic issues that impact people of color, Black Americans throughout this country. These economic issues have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of that, I think they've been brought to the forefront, and that's part of our discussion here that we want to have. So I'm going to begin by going directly to Congressman Gregory Meek of New York. Just a quick introduction. Gregory Meek is chairman of the House Financial Service Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions, and is a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So Congressman Meeks, like they do to you guys up here on Capitol Hill, I don't have that little red button, but I've been told you've got 3 minutes to make your brief remarks, and we will then open it up for your comments, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me first thank Chairman Cleaver for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Representative David Scott and Representative Alma Adams, for their continued hard work and dedication to our country and to the issues facing minority and low-income communities in particular. Let me also say thank you to our two Fed presidents here today, Dr. Bostic and Dr. Williams from the Atlanta and New York Fed, respectively. And finally, Bob, it's really great to see you, a good friend of mine and one that I, like Reverend Cleaver, will be calling on you in the future, moderating this panel. This has been, and you have been, no question, a pioneer in the Black community, not only in building wealth and investing in the community, but also in leveraging your platform to advocate for and give a voice to Black community issues for years. And we thank you for that, Brother Johnson. Let me say quickly, even before COVID, the financial insecurity was growing in our communities. A very large share of African-American families and American families generally were struggling to make ends meet. Circumstances in the Black community were even worse than in others, as the community had yet to fully recover from the 2008 financial crisis, which hit Black homeowners especially hard. Indeed, Black families' median net worth is less than 15% than that of white families. And Black home ownership rate has seen the most dramatic drop of any racial or ethnic group since 2001. Black home ownership is back to levels not seen since the 1960s, the civil rights movement. We've lost a great deal of wealth. The Fed's policy appears to be accepting structural discrimination as a given and working to compensate for it by trying to keep unemployment as low as possible, for as long as possible, so the Black and brown communities eventually benefit from the expansion. In other words, when it comes to jobs, incomes, and wealth for the Black community, it's like the accounting standard, last in and first out. We cannot accept that as a given. Everyone else gets to enter the race months or years ahead of us, and we are just told to be patient and then run faster whenever we do enter the race. That's just not going to work or be good anymore. As it relates to the Fed and government policy, I would argue it implies dedicating far more resources to quantifying the problem and developing solutions that don't just look at the micro environment, but target specifically the most impacted segments of society. It requires more work, more imagination, and more uncomfortable conversations. But it is obviously the right thing to do, and a recognition that national solutions must stretch to reach those most impacted first and foremost. So thank you, Bob, for that. I hope I didn't go over the 3-minute mark because the red light didn't come up here. So I'll stop there and yield back to you.
I'll always give you a lot of leeway, Congressman. We now turn to Congressman David Scott of Georgia. Congressman Scott, who is a senior member of the House Financial Service Committee, is chairman of the House Agricultural Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit. Congressman Scott, you're up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. And let me just commend you. I'm a great fan of yours, B.E.T., all the great work you've done in broadcasting, and as a premier, one of our premier and leading African-American businessmen. And of course, it's always great to be with my colleagues, Reverend Cleaver, Miss Adams, Mr. Meeks, and to you, Mr. Boston, our very first African-American regional president of the Federal Reserve Board. Congratulations. It's good to have you here. And to you, Mr. Williams, I read your comments and the remarks that you have made and some of your ideas that you have been implementing with the New York Fed. And they sort of parallel some of the areas that I have been working with. And let me just say that how critical it is, how important it is that the Federal Reserve is taking on this issue of equitable economic recovery. There's nobody that's more suited to do it with the capacity, with the power, with the unique leadership of being the primary arbiter of our supply of money and where it goes. And I think we should give a tip of the hat to the great Alexander Hamilton, who had the foresight to be able to understand that our banking system, our financial system, is the foundation of this great economy. But we needed a central bank that would be the foundation and the cornerstone of our financial system. And that role is to the Fed. Took a while before folks could understand the meaning of it. We had to go through the Revolutionary War. Hamilton tried to fix that. It had to go through the Civil Wars. The banking systems wouldn't come together. But when J.P. Morgan made all that money, categorizing all those different banks, they became together in 1913, and they founded and put together the Federal Reserve System, without which we wouldn't have made it through the Depression, and without which we wouldn't have made it through the downturn we had in 2008. And so it gives me great pleasure. But let me just start off by making a few observations, because
Congressman, I'm going to have to exercise the power of the chair and ask you.
Oh, all right, fine.
Move a little forward on. All right. Well, thank you very much. My next guest, and for all of you, is Congresswoman Alma Adams of North Carolina. Dr. Adams is a member of the House Financial Services Committee and serves as chairwoman of the Committee on Education and Labor, Subcommittee on Workforce Protection. Congresswoman Adams also serves as vice chairwoman of the House Agriculture Committee. Congresswoman Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, and Congressman Cleaver. Thank you for convening this discussion on economic justice and for your continued leadership on issues that impact the financial wellness of the Black community. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate alongside my committee colleagues, Congressman Meeks, Congressman Scott, and Federal Reserve Presidents Bostic and Williams. We're currently experiencing the greatest financial crisis in the history of our country due to COVID-19 pandemic, exacerbated by the lack of a coordinated federal response to address this public health crisis. And we know from experience from previous economic downturns, recessions, and depressions, that every American will not experience this financial crisis in the same way. In fact, the recovery process has always been lopsided and uneven, and folks who were struggling, hurting, or financially disadvantaged prior to the crisis will emerge in even worse shape. So we already know this to be true, so we must do all we can to ensure that the recovery process is equitable. In order to ensure the Black community and other vulnerable minority or low-income communities weather this crisis, it's absolutely critical for us to examine the financial costs of systemic racism. And so, as we seek to understand the causes of the deep economic disparities that existed before COVID-19, I look forward to discussing how the Federal Reserve is responding to rescue and support Black communities, what an equitable recovery must look like for communities of color, and ultimately what the Federal Reserve's role can be and should be in fostering financial resilience in communities of color. We've got to get this right. Too much is at stake for the health and wealth of our future generations. So thank you again to President Bostic, President Williams, for joining us today and for being a part of this very, very critical and important conversation.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Adams, and thank all the other members for your remarks. I would now like to introduce our two featured guests who have said that they would like to forego any opening remarks because they wanted to have more of an open dialogue. They want to take as much time to have an interaction. And I think in that interaction, if you think of the concept of what people call the New England Circle, where people of a commonality of interest who have a fundamental belief that working together they can solve problems. That's the spirit which the two members of the Federal Reserve have come here, because as I said earlier, they share not only the concern of members of Congress, but share the concerns of people of this country, and the great responsibility that they have at the Federal Reserve is something that in many ways, many of us in the Black community don't understand that power of that organization. And here's a chance for you members of Congress to ask questions that will help them inform the community of what their role is, and for them to explain how they're going to use the charter that they have since the founding of the Reserve back in 1913 to do the things that they're charged to do, and do those things in the best interest of the people of the United States. So with that in mind, I will give my introduction of Dr. John Williams. John is President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Vice Chairman of the Federal Open Markets Committee. He was named President of the Federal Reserve in 2018. Prior to this appointment, he served as President of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Before that, he was an Executive Vice President and Director of Research for the San Francisco Fed. So without further ado, President Williams, you're on deck.
Well, thank you very much. I really very pleased to participate in this discussion. I thought the opening remarks, I agreed with the comments of already. I'm looking forward to this discussion, this very important time, especially how do we achieve this equitable recovery that many of you talked about. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And following him, of course, is the President Bostic, who was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and also a member of the FOMC. Dr. Raphael Bostic, prior to this appointment, was chair of the Department of Governance and Management and the Policy Process at the University of Southern Cal School of Public Policy. Prior to that, President Bostic was Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the Department of Urban Development. President Bostic.
Well, thank you. It's really good to be here. I want to thank Congressman Cleaver for inviting us, and for all of you for participating. Representative Scott, I was in your district just a couple of days ago. It's good to see someone from the Atlanta area here. I'm really glad to have this conversation. You know, this has been something that that a lot of people have been talking about, and I'm just glad that I'm part of a Federal Reserve that's willing and open to talk about it and really be very transparent about our desire to really see some real change. So looking forward to this conversation, and thank you again for having us.
Well, thank you very much. And let's start off again, as I said, with this open dialogue of discussion. I'll sort of put it on the table, and Congressman Cleaver, I'm going to ask you to sort of comment on this. Do you feel, where you sit as a member of Congress, that the Federal Reserve has all the tools in its charter to do what is in the best interest of Black people in dealing with the socioeconomic issues we confront daily, even long before COVID, and particularly post-COVID? Or would you suggest that perhaps Congress should give them additional tools to carry out their assignment and their responsibility?
Well, Ron Paul said they had super tools already, but let me not digress. I think that the Federal Reserve does have all of the power it needs to do all of the things we need. You know, my greatest concern is related to what I just said about former member Mr. Paul, that we have got to, I think, protect the Federal Reserve as best as we can, those of us in the legislative bodies, because there is almost always going to be an annual move toward trying to dismantle the central banks. I've been on this committee for 16 years with all the other members up here except for Dr. Adams. And so we have seen attempts to dismantle that over the years. I think that I have been amazed, no matter who the federal chairman was, on how they can come up with these plans that we've used in 2008, for example, that actually helped pull us out of what could have become a depression. So I don't have any. I don't think I have any suggestions on any additional power. I think they currently hold it. What we've got to do is hold Congress back from trying to come in and dictate what the Federal Reserve does.
Okay. Well, I'll turn it over to President Williams. President Williams, you want to comment on this question of if you had your druthers, would you ask for additional authority within your charter to do things that could address the issues we're talking about here, the pandemic, the socioeconomic wealth inequality and income inequality in the Black community?
I think we have the powers that we need to do our part of that, and whether it's on monetary policy, the supervision aspects, the work we do in community development and around the Community Reinvestment Act and those. So I think we have what we need for that. Of course, what we really need is a very strong partnership where Congress and government at the state and federal, state, and local levels are doing their part on these issues. Obviously, nonprofits and philanthropy is doing its part, and we're all working together using our tools appropriately for situations that we have, and that we're working together on that. And I think that's really an important role for the Federal Reserve, is really our ability to convene and catalyze thinking, research, and work in the communities, again, bringing together business, banks, nonprofits, and government to work together on addressing these very important issues.
Raphael, you want to add to that discussion?
Yeah, I would just echo a bit of what John said, in the sense that there are some things that we can do, but there are things that we can't do. So, going through this pandemic, a lot of businesses have said, we need grant money. We need bridges to get us to the next end of this crisis. And we don't have the authority or the power to do that. What we can do is provide lending. We can provide technical assistance. We can talk to community members. So I do a lot of talking to community members so that I find out what's happening in real time and bring that to policymakers like the others on this panel so they can make the decisions that need to be done. And I feel like we have a lot of capacity to do that. And I think that's an important element of what we're doing. The other thing I would say, which I think most people don't know about the Fed, is that we have people on all of our staffs that have expertise in all the things that are happening in local communities. Affordable housing development, workforce development training, things around education and how do we facilitate financial literacy. These are all other ways that we contribute to the development and the stabilization of communities. But there are going to be targeted things that are going to need to happen. And John's right, we don't have the authority to do those in most instances.
Thank you, Matt. Congressman Scott, I'd like to ask you to sort of comment on some of the statistics and explain in your mind, is this a Federal Reserve issue that has to be addressed, or is this a more of a fiscal policy congressional legislation problem? You got, as Congressman Meeks pointed out, the income gap between Black and white Americans is close to 10 to 12 times, depending on how you look at the numbers. You look at the lack of access to capital that African Americans confront. Home ownership, African Americans at about 40% compared to 70% for white Americans. When you look at all of these disparities and you try to say, how do we address them to bring income equality to a reality in this country? Who do you think should carry the weight on this? The Federal Reserve, because of its huge authority over the big money center banks as well as others? Or is this something that needs to be looked at the legislative level in terms of government fiscal policy?
I think the Federal Reserve, because when we deal with the Federal Reserve, we're dealing with independence, an independent entity that controls the supply and disposition of money. At the core, at the bottom of this issue is economics. Let me first start with the fact that we got a split economy now. It's like two trains running with this pandemic. And we must respond to the immediacy of the situation because our very economy is at stake. Number one, split economy. You have a certain group of our citizenry working in teleconferencing, working at home. And these are the higher income individuals who are, because they're away, they're at home, they're making higher salaries. And then you have the other train running, the people who are out there in the grocery stores, in the fire department, the police department, on the front lines. They have to be there with their physicality, which makes them, and they're at the lower end of the scale and are in a more, a less healthy situation. Nowhere is that more persistent than with African Americans, Black people, and Hispanics. So if the Fed, the reason I say the Fed, because I think the Fed is certainly, this is why I was so excited about this session today, because the Fed is the best entity to really deal with equitable recovery. But first, the Fed has to consider what now is an inequitable crisis that has disproportionately harmed those most in need. And what we must clearly understand is that an equitable recovery does not mean a recovery that is felt equally among all Americans. Rather, it means that the Fed must ensure that this economic recovery efforts are targeted toward those who have lost the most and those whom financial stability, economic stability is furthest away. That means you're going to have to put, and I'll be brief here, we're going to have to identify. The Fed has to understand that there's no difference between this problem and what happened in 2008 when Paulson and Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner came before our committee. There was no question asked. The answer was the Fed's got to put money into this and bail the banks out. We got to have that same targeted approach to give money to the lower income areas and focus on the two pillars of housing and jobs.
That's a great statement. Let me turn it over now to the two members of the Federal Reserve, two presidents of the Federal Reserve. So Raphael, why don't you comment on what the congressman had just stated?
So I want to take this in two totally different directions. The first is, I totally agree with Representative Scott in the sense that we have two economies and two realities going on at the same time. And that those who are the most precarious are bearing the most burden and having the most pain. And we can never lose sight of that. And I think that you've heard me talk about this, you've heard John and others around the system. We understand that, and that's very important. And you know, we actually just, as part of this pandemic, stood up a survey of lower income and minority communities so that we understand what's happening with Black businesses and what's happening with nonprofits who provide essential services and what's happening to families and how long do they think this is going to go. And one of the things that's come out very clearly is that it's going to take a long time, much longer than many affluent communities, to recover. So when we think about providing relief, when we think about providing ongoing support, we've got to have that time horizon in mind. We can't, the flag just can't go up and say, we're done, right? There are going to be a lot of people for a long time who are going to be struggling. Now, I want to answer Bob's question at the opening, which is it the Fed or is it somebody else? And I actually think I don't like that question. I actually think the answer is both, right? Everyone's got to step in. This is an all hands situation, and we need to make sure that we do what we do. And we're going to, I pledge you, my bank and John and the system, we're going to be out there front and center on this. But just us by ourselves are not going to be able to shrink these disparities because they have come from a whole host of different places and they've emerged over decades. Right? These are things that are much more institutional that we're going to have to address. So, I think we're all in this together. That's why I think I know for me, I'm really happy to have this joint conversation so that we can come to this and talk about this as a unified group.
Well, John, obviously as president of the New York Fed, you have tremendous authority overseeing the big money center banks. And one of your charters in your of the Fed is, for all the Feds, in fact, is employment maximization. And when you look at a situation where the federal government is focused on policies that get involved in politics to an extent, but yet you know what your responsibilities are, how do you maneuver between fiscal policy that gets caught up in every ounce of political differences that exist in this country and your ability to do what you're chartered to do to help those folks who are most in need in the housing area? And it's going on now in housing, it's going on now in access to capital. How do you maneuver between what the politics is pushing and what your job is?
Well, we just have a laser-like focus on our dual mandate. You know, Congress has told us maximum employment, price stability, and that's what we need to focus on when it comes to monetary policy. And that's what we just think about, how do we best achieve that? What do we need to do? And I'll come back to Congressman Scott's comments. I mean, we're doing more today than we did even back in 2008 and 9 in terms of supporting the economy, supporting businesses, and supporting households today, given the severity of the situation we're in. And I often describe a FOMC meeting as a very strange experience back when we had them in person, because you're in Washington, D.C., the most political city in this country. You're right in the center of the city, and we don't talk politics. We don't talk partisan politics. We let you do your job for all the members of Congress here, and we focus on how do we best use the tools that we have and use them as appropriate to get the economy back on its feet, get Americans back to work, and do the very best we can. And so that's what we do. That's what we've always done, and that's what we're committed to doing. And we're committed to also doing, coming up with new approaches and new ways to do it, as we've shown over the past 4 months. We're not shy about, doing whatever it takes to get this economy through this really difficult situation and hopefully back to that maximum employment goal as soon as possible.
And Bob, can I just jump in here for a second?
Sure.
I'm sorry, because listening to John triggered something that Congressman Meek said about us doing more work, having more imagination, and having more uncomfortable conversations. I will tell you, I've been at this job for more than 3 years. In the last 4 months, I've not seen people work harder. I've not seen people think more creatively about things. And certainly in the wake of the George Floyd's killing, have a ton of uncomfortable conversations about sort of how are we gonna change our messaging to make sure that we're maximally impacting all Americans, because it's clear that there were things going on that we weren't reaching to. So I think we are going down the path that you have recommended for us, and we're gonna continue to talk about that. And it's all about, John, we've acted fast and we've acted boldly, and we're gonna continue to be there. We're not gonna step away until everyone has gotten to a better place.
Yeah, Congresswoman Adams, I'd like you to address this issue. Usually when you think about a health pandemic like we're facing today, or crisis of this, global crisis of this magnitude, your normal instinct is not to look for the banks to solve the problem. Your normal instinct is look to the healthcare institutions to do it. But here we are talking about the role of the Fed in addressing COVID today and post-COVID when it's finally eliminated, hopefully. How do you feel right now, if you had your way to say, what should the Federal Reserve be doing in dealing with the COVID crisis as it affects Black families in this country?
Well, listening to my colleagues and to the presidents there, I've got to tell you, one size does not fit all. I think across the board, our minority communities are hurting most with a lot of outsized student loan debt burdens as far as housing insecurity, food insecurity, and so forth. But I think that the feds have two broad mandates: maximum employment and price controls. And while the feds have created special lending facilities to at the same time address liquidity in the marketplace, those tools are not targeted enough. So given the broad mandates and existing financial instruments, I guess we've got to think about, do we need additional tools to assist the Black communities? And so I believe that the feds must apply a racial and economic equity lens. And that should play a role in the long-term planning and the goals for, I think, the recovery that we want to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Congressman Gregory, when you look at what happened to, at least it's been reported, with the PPP program, and that there were just very few Black businesses that were able to get loans out of that program, and many of the loans were all distributed by the large banks, and many Black businesses, small and some large, didn't have those in-depth relationship with those large bank lenders. And so do you think that the Fed should have been more aggressive in pushing Treasury or pushing the banks to make sure that the PPP program went to those companies that most needed and went to them as quickly as possible?
Yeah, Bob, I think I agree with you. I think that we've got to think out of the box. And that's what doesn't happen enough. And that's why I said you have to have the hard conversations. I think that there's more to be done. For example, I do think that the Fed, who has the largest, and I guess they're the biggest recruiter of economic PhDs in the country. And it has a powerful mandate to maintain the functioning of capital markets and banking systems. But that's one segment, because those that are in that area, there's certain areas, the Amazons of the world, et cetera, they're making a great deal of money. They have all the relationships. But when you look at the small mom and pop businesses that you're talking about, the barber shops, the florists, the individual, some of the not-for-profits like churches, et cetera, they don't have the contacts and the facilities with these banks, the relationships. And so the Fed can invest money, I think, and put more money in talking about the broader economic cost of racial inequality and discrimination, particularly as it pertains to some of our small businesses, which is what you're talking about. So, and then talking to Congress, because I agree with the fact that it's both of us that got to work together. So the Fed can also be the educator for members of Congress when you're dealing with the economic cost of racial inequality and discrimination, and then can also lead by example. For example, I think that when the Fed launched its suite of liquidity facilities to support the economy, it missed an opportunity to set programs like my colleague Alma Adams was talking about that specifically targeted the impacted communities the most. Those are the communities that are in districts that we represent, some urban and some rural. And they need to go in that, thinking out of the box in that regard. And I would hope that Mr. Bostic and Mr. Williams would agree with that, so that we can invest more in thinking out of the box and making sure that we put facilities directly into communities that need it most.
Well, along that line, and John and Raphael, you know, you couldn't come to a meeting of Congressional Black Caucus members without talking about black banks. And the question I want to put on the table is, what could the Fed do to get black banks to scale where they can be significant in providing lending credit into the black community, to move people away from payday lending, to move people away to invest in homes and every other need that they might have from a credit standpoint. I read an article in Axios a couple of days ago that said this, and it was kind of shocking, that if all the black businesses in the country put their total revenue into black banks over a 10-year period, they would not have money equal to 1/4 of the revenue in JP Morgan Chase. Why? What can the Fed do to make black-owned banks a real source of credit and access to capital in the black community? John?
Well, I agree with everything you just said, because I think it requires really bringing together a whole bunch of those pieces, in terms of whether it's the banking sector, whether it's the business sector, local and state local governments and others to work together to really help and working with the Fed and others on developing in terms of economic development, in terms of community development. How can we bring, communities together and strengthen the financial institutions and help the local communities grow? I think that, when I think about this, I always think it's not just about the banks or about housing. I think it's really about how all the pieces fit together. If you're going to have a really vibrant, strong economic community, you need to have obviously business and financial institutions, but you need schools, you need transportation, and you need health and grocery stores. So one of the efforts that we have been working on for years now is really trying to connect all those dots and bring together all the stakeholders to help work together to develop all those pieces so that they fit together. And of course, that would include the local banks and the smallest businesses as part of that fabric that helps build the really strong, vibrant communities.
Let me just jump in to say, the Black-owned banks are a very important part of the Black community, and their absence is a loss for those communities. It's actually a loss for America. And I think one of the things that we need to do is really say very clearly, use our bully pulpit to say, look, it is important that these institutions are supported so they can provide all of the additional support that John's talking about in terms of the housing and the small businesses, particularly where small businesses are concerned. And I was talking with a Black-owned banker just today where she was saying, I see opportunity in Black communities different than a Bank of America banker is going to see, because I'm in this community, I'm of this community, and I understand how it works. We can't afford to lose that. So there have been a number of initiatives just recently where businesses have pledged to put sizable deposits in the banks to get their asset levels up. But there may be other opportunities through legislation and other things for us to get more support. So I actually penned an op-ed a couple of months ago suggesting that maybe the Black-owned banks need to have an aggregator that does all the compliance so that we don't have replicated costs across all these institutions, so they can devote their resources to the thing that's the most important, which is getting capital out into the community and getting support to those communities. So I think there are a lot of ideas out there, and I'm hopeful that as we move forward, as we deal with the reckoning that you all have identified, this becomes an issue that we talk a whole lot more about.
Bob, if I could jump in for 1 second,
Sure.
Bob, just to follow up on that, because it is important. And one of the things, banking deserts are coming into communities of color all over. So there's no banks in many of these areas, so they could have those relationships that we're talking about. And you're right, as far as what they have, I believe that the federal government, the Fed and the Treasury can do more also, because what they do, they deposit, they could put large sums of deposits in these Black banks that would help sustain them themselves. So there's a bill that Maxine Waters and I are sponsoring on the House side that Senator Warner, Booker, and are doing, and Schumer, and our new, and Senator Harris are sponsoring on the Senate side, working to try to put another 15 to 20 billion dollars into MDIs and CDFIs that will then help them. And then the pressure on the big banks like Bank of America, Citi, and Wells Fargo for them to invest in these banks also, because they don't want to do the business that is happening in these communities anyway. They have basically said that that's not their model. So by investing in them, and then when we look at CRA, as we've been trying to modernize CRA, look at that or some other incentives to get additional dollars in to stabilize the MDIs and the CDFIs in our various communities.
Bob, could I add there a minute? I want to piggyback on what Greg was saying. This is why I said that the Fed is unique, because of your authority with the money supply. There is a great need now. There is a health crisis. Housing is a health crisis. How can we take care of the health of our people, particularly those who are lower income, African Americans and Hispanics? And when we say social distance, shelter where you are, stay in your home, when they can't pay their mortgage to have the home, or stay there when they don't have the rent to pay, or they don't even have the money to be able to pay for the water, for the electricity, for their utilities.
Yeah.
All of this is happening.
Yeah,
People
Congressman
are
Scott,
on the street. So let me round up on this.
Yeah,
Here's my point. My point is this. Let's stop running around the bush. We need the Fed to respond to these issues with our Black banks by using them as the vehicle, as a depository. Put the money there so that the mortgage can keep flowing. The rent can stay flowing. It ain't going to the individual homeowner renter. It's going to keep our economy, keeping the companies, keeping the small banks. You know who is making these loans? It is the Black banks. They're the ones that are making their money from mortgages. And if we don't make sure those mortgages are going through, banks are going out of business.
Thank Congressman Scott. I appreciate
Can I add something?
Well, yeah, by all means.
Okay, I just want to say that particularly when we were going through the PPP, that I had conversations with many of the banks here, the CDFIs as well. We have in North Carolina mechanics and farmers. I remember when they got started, M&F we call them. But one of the things that that they told me was they really didn't have, there was not enough money invested at first for them so that they could increase the loans, the lending capacity that they had. So I think that's one of the things that I think would help. If they had more money on the front end, then they could invest more and could have given more to a lot of these small businesses to keep them afloat.
Well, thank you very much. I think we run out of time that we've been allotted, but I want to thank all the participants for being a part of this. I hope it was informative for all of our Zoom listeners. And I'm going to turn it over now to Congressman Cleaver to say his final remarks and to thank everybody for sharing the time to be a part of this session. Congressman Cleaver.
Bob Johnson, thank you so much for the generosity of giving us this time. And I appreciate very much you leading this discussion so ably. I'm not sure that I could have asked anybody who could have done this better. So thank you. I'm grateful for your voice out here in the community and in the world on these important issues. So thank you again for being here. And to our participants, my fraternity brothers, both David Scott and Gregory Meeks, and my sister, Alma Adams. Thank you all for your presence today and for your insightful comments. I think it was that great American philosopher Woody Allen, who said 90% of success is just showing up. So Presidents Williams and Bostic, thank you for showing up. I think, and I'm very serious, Mr. Bostic, I read your comments in your op-ed in New York Times, and I was just so taken aback by the candor that you spoke, and so thank you very much for that. And I look forward to continuing this great conversation with all of you who do so much important work for our country every single day. Let me end up by saying, John Lewis and I've known each other for 30 years at least. I met him in the Pilgrim Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama in 1973 at the National Convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I had come in from Kansas City. I was still in seminary at the time. And so I was just amazed to see John Lewis in person. I walked up and met him and started talking to him. And he referred to me. He said, well, thank you so much for coming and talking to me, young brother. And I realized on the day of his funeral that John Lewis, after 30 years, didn't know my name. About a month before he died, he was walking down the aisle and I was sitting next to ALC Hastings, and I hit him on the shoulder, and I turned around, and he turned around and said, hey, young brother. I said, you doing okay? He said, young brother, I'm doing fine. I said, so I think he didn't even know my name. I was young brother for 30 years. You know, but I still love him. I still love him anyway. But he was an American icon and a legacy of his own in freedom fighting. But in his closing charge to our country, which he penned a few days before he passed, and it was to be used on the day of his funeral, he said, and I quote, "Walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and that of power be with you and be your guide," unquote. And so that's what I wish for all of you. Let the spirit of peace and power be everlasting, love, and may it be your guide. God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.